everybody. Welcome to Dangerous Ideas. I'm Lee Camp. Thank you for joining me today. As you may notice from the weirdo background behind me, I am traveling to see family, so I'm bringing you some interesting and unusual episodes, some new times, some new schedulings. Sometimes I'll be doing them pantsless. A lot of differences, but really it's the same shit. But important nonetheless, very important. So thank you for being here, and thank you for clicking thumbs up and clicking share and subscribe and all that good stuff. But today, I gotta be honest, I think this is probably one of the most important episodes I've had for a while. Because in this episode, I'm gonna bring you convincing arguments that we're seeing the end of Israel's economy, which would spell the end of Israel as an oppressive apartheid regime. And I'm going to bring you pretty compelling evidence that we're seeing the end of the Democrats, as at least as a political manifestation, the way they've existed for many years now. That doesn't just mean the Republicans are going to win everything, but it's a little more complicated than that. Maybe they'll fuse into one party rather than pretending to be two, which they've already fused into one party, but we get to pretend that they're two different things, which is really great for everything in the world, and all this stuff is awesome. So I'm going to be bringing you that right now, both those stories, incredibly important stories. And also, in the second half of this episode, I'm going to go ahead and play my interview from last week with Ben Norton. The reason if you've already seen it, the reason I'm playing it again is because I haven't actually put it on a live stream. It was put up as a separate video, and I realized that many of you may not have caught it because of that. So I figured, why not throw it into this live stream? If you've already seen it, you're welcome to turn it off. That's the wonderful thing about things you've seen before. So, but if you haven't seen it, you get a brand new interview with journalist Ben Norton, which is also an incredibly important interview. Okay, let's start off, though, with the evidence, the proof that we're seeing the end of Israel's economy, which would spell the end of Israel as we know it, which would also spell the end of genocide, which is a good thing. I'm going to put that down. I'm going to jot that down right now as a good thing. And for those of you who are regular viewers, you may go, well, I already saw that you covered how a bunch of businesses in Israel have collapsed. In fact, that number is 46,000 businesses across Israel have collapsed since October 7th because of Israel's actions. Not because of what happened on October 7th, because of everything Israel has done since October 7th and some on October 7th. That is why 46,000 businesses have collapsed in Israel, and they're estimating it's going to be 65,000 have collapsed across Israel by the end of the year. I already brought you that, but it's actually much larger than just that, and that's why this is not the same story I brought you the other day, but instead a larger story. It's from Mondo Vice. They do great work. The end of Israel's economy. No state on earth, it says, has been able to inflict so much damage to the Israeli economy as the state of Israel itself. And the result is growing indications that the Israeli economy has reached an impasse with no path forward as long as the state remains an apartheid Zionist state rejected by the whole world except the US and Germany. And you may say, well, it's not rejected by everybody. You know, there's also Canada and to some degree Britain. And yeah, but they're not, in many ways, they're vassal states to the United States. So really, the only two propping up the U.S. are the U.S. empire and Germany, although I'd argue Germany is also a vassal state to the United States. But anyway, if you look at the UN votes, it really is just the U.S. that's stopping the UN from 100% voting against Israel. Estimates by the UN are that 70% of the houses in Gaza have been destroyed. I'm not going to go through all the Gaza numbers because you already know them, but it also talks about 40,000 Palestinians being murdered, 15,000 of those children, 146,000 additional Palestinians to die in the coming months from health complications due to injury, starvation, disease. So 70% of the houses have been destroyed. The rubble, the UN estimates, will take 15 years to clear, just to clear, not to rebuild, just to clear. And then it continues. The economic indicators speak of nothing less than an economic catastrophe in Israel. Not for Gaza. Obviously, Gaza's not doing well, but this is for Israel. Over 46,000 businesses have gone bankrupt. Tourism has essentially stopped. Israel's credit rating was lowered. Israeli bonds are sold at the prices of almost junk bonds. And the foreign investments that have already dropped by 60% in the first quarter of 2023 show no prospects of recovery. Dropped by 60%, foreign investments have. And also tourism, which I just mentioned, which has collapsed, was a major component of the Israeli economy. The majority of the money invested in Israeli investment funds was diverted to investments abroad because Israelis do not want their own pension funds and insurance funds on their own savings to be tied up in the fate of their own state, which they know is committing a genocide and is in cataclysmic times. This has caused a surprising stability in the Israeli stock market because funds invested in foreign stocks and bonds generated profit in foreign currency, which was multiplied by the rise in the exchange rate between foreign currencies in the Israeli shekel. But then Intel, obviously a major corporation, scuttled a $25 billion investment plan in Israel, the biggest BDS victory ever. They ended a $25 billion plan to invest in Israel, and that was due to boycott, divest, and sanctions. Most of you, of course, know about BDS. BDS incredibly important. I have talked a lot about how important BDS is and how we should all be involved in boycotting companies connected to Israel in order to stop their genocide. To continue from the article, these are all financial indicators, but the crisis strikes deeper at the means of production of the Israeli economy. Israel's power grid, which has largely switched to natural gas, still depends on coal to supply the demand. The biggest supplier of coal to Israel is Colombia, which announced that it would suspend coal shipments to Israel as long as the genocide was ongoing. After Colombia, the next two biggest suppliers are South Africa and Russia, both of which, you may know, are showing signs of also cutting off a lot of their cooperation with Israel because they are opposed to the genocide. Without reliable and continuous electricity, Israel will no longer be able to pretend to be a developed economy. Server farms do not work without 24-hour power, and no one knows how many blackouts the Israeli high-tech sector could potentially survive. International tech companies have already started closing their branches in Israel. I mean, this is everything. This is everything the Israeli economy is all just sinking. And it's due to their own behavior. It's due to the fact that they're committing genocide. It's due to the fact that they are just obliterating a whole society and acting like it's morally okay. So they're doing it to themselves, which is kind of fascinating because this is kind of what Hamas wanted, right? For Israel to collapse and no longer be able to imprison them in an open-air prison and have 5,000 hostages pre-October 7th, etc. It's what Hamas wanted, but this is all due to Israel's actions. This is not due to Hamas's actions. This is due to Israel's actions. This is due to Israel's genocide. Israeli newspapers are full of articles about the exodus of educated Israelis leaving the country. Professor Dan Ben David, a famous economist, argued that the Israeli economy is held together by just 300,000 people, the senior staff in universities, tech companies, and hospitals. Once a significant portion of these people leaves, he says, we won't become a third world country. We just won't be anymore. Because obviously, in order to be this, high-tech, sophisticated society that Israel, brags about being, you have to have pretty high-level people, very smart and educated people. And those are also the people that often tend to see the writing on the wall and flee a sinking ship. They say the estimates of the number of Israelis who have already left varies wildly because it is tough to know like how many are just taking long vacations abroad, which apparently is a big thing right now for Israelis, thinking they can wait it out and then go back afterwards. But so far there's been no afterwards. So how many have actually fled and will never come back is very unclear. The two sectors of the Israeli economy that do not report a crash are the arms companies, big surprise, which are reporting high sales, you think? And the exits, which is not a term I had heard before, as in EXITS, the exits, as international corporations scavenge the carcasses of Israel's tech sector looking for bargains. I don't know if exits is a standard financial term, and I'm just a moron for not knowing it. But anyway, even Google expressed interest in buying the Israeli cybersecurity company Wiz, founded by Israeli intelligence officers who are eager to sell their company to Google in order to be able to leave Israel. So, yet again, a top Israeli company chomping at the bit to get the hell out. In the age of the information economy, the economic prospects of states are neither determined by raw materials nor the quality of the workforce. And this is an interesting point and an important one about just the reality of successful states in general nowadays. They argue in this article, instead, we live in an era of economy of expectations. And this also goes for individual companies. They're pretty much the same. Individual companies now are often successful off of expectations. And Tesla is the perfect example of this. Elon Musk is the perfect example of this. Most of what has been achieved, quote unquote, by Tesla and by the other companies that Elon Musk has been the head of is actually about expectations and about how much he can keep his name in the news and that kind of thing. It's not that much about how much they've produced. Now, Tesla, the car company, part of his empire, is doing pretty well nowadays, but it only became profitable a few years ago. Most of the money that Tesla was making before that was due to selling carbon offsets rather than actually producing anything. And so the fact that Tesla's stock, I don't know if it still is, but for a long time was worth more than all of the big four automakers combined, had a lot to do with the economy of expectations and the fact that it's about keeping your name, but the name of the company, the name of Elon Musk, etc., at the top of newspapers and websites, etc. And then people invest in the stock, which is a Ponzi scheme, etc. And it all goes off of that. So when you have Israel collapsing in this way, it's the reverse. Their economy has nothing because there are no expectations. This is a genocidal maniac country committing genocide and people fleeing from Israel, not out of safety, but out of, not out of fear for the tiny Hamas rocket that occasionally hits, but out of fear for what Israel's doing to their own society. I suppose there may be some fear of Iran attacks and Hezbollah, depending on what part of Israel you live in, but that's not, for the most part, Tel Aviv. Although they did, Yemen hit Tel Aviv recently. The hype of Israel's startup nation, quote unquote, has turned into shutdown nation. Two senior Israeli economists, Eugene Kendall and Ron Sur, published a secret report in which they predict that Israel will not survive to its 100th year. And I'd say that's absolutely true. How can you be just an utterly genocidal nation and expect to survive? The only reason Israel has survived even to this point, at least in this form of a genocidal oppressive regime, is because of the help of the United States and the propaganda of the United States and the propaganda of Israel in the United States. It's a combination of lies, money, and guns, which sounds like a good weekend, good 3-day weekend, I'll be honest, but not good for a nation state long term. Good for a little while. To wrap up this article, 3 Israeli historians, 2 Zionists and 1 anti-Zionist, so both sides of the spectrum, have declared that the Zionist project has come to an end. When a critical mass of Israelis, regardless of their political opinions, become convinced that Israeli apartheid has become unsustainable, they will no longer agree to invest energy and money and risk their lives and their families for the sake of the Zionist project. They will seek out a better future for themselves, as every sane person would, either by leaving Israel or, better yet, by working towards a new and democratic political system in Palestine. One person, one vote, and a future in which everyone of every religion and ethnicity can have a stake. So important there. That's the thing, is you're seeing, because Israel is this settler colonial state that was created by stealing land, and because everybody living there by definition, unless you're Palestinian, and what was it, 4% were Jewish pre-Israel in that area, so almost everyone, maybe not every, but just about everybody there in Israel is either, first generation or second generation. Their grandparents immigrated there. And with very few exceptions, tiny number of exceptions, 4%, 6%, something like that. So that means that their ties to that area are not as strong as someone who's been living in, Italy for 400 years. My family's been here for 400 years, 1,000 years. I'm not leaving here unless you kill me. So most of these groups have connections elsewhere. They have connections in Russia and in America, and hell, Netanyahu's American. I mean, Netanyahu grew up in Pennsylvania, went to MIT, worked at Boston Consulting Group or whatever, and so he's an American. Changed his last name to sound more Israeli rather than Polish. So it just makes it easier for a lot of these people with dual citizenship. Just makes it easier for Israelis to leave, and a lot of them begin thinking about what's safest for their family, which is hilarious, because the idea of Israel, when it was first founded, was, well, this is the only way Jews are going to be safe, which is a dumb idea, but that was the concept that they went with. And every time Biden says that, with no Israel, then Jews aren't safe anywhere. And it's like, really? You're planning on killing us sometime soon? Is that what you're saying, Biden? But this is an epic story, this aspect of it. And this should be all over the mainstream media if they weren't cowards and pathetic assholes. That as Israel is utterly obliterating and committing genocide across Gaza, they're killing Israel. They're killing the nation of Israel. This is the death knell, because you cannot have an advanced society with zero economy. And there is not much that's left propping Israel up as a system, as a society. That article there did a great point of giving just a few little steps that it would take for it officially to be done, at least economically. So if Netanyahu and the certain aspects of the Israeli government are pushing for a much broader war with Hezbollah and Iran and everything, then Israel becomes even less safe, because you're going to have Iranian missiles hitting regularly, and you're just going to see a mass flight out of Israel. And when you have no economy and half the number of people you used to have, it doesn't seem possible that Israel could continue, which is a good thing when you're a genocidal apartheid state. Sorry. If you weren't a genocidal apartheid state that stole all the land, then we'd talk. We have a discussion. All right. Well, let me move on to it's sad news. I mean, I hesitate to say it's good news, but maybe the evidence to everyone that the duopoly, the two-party system, is actually one party. Maybe this will facilitate people waking up to that. Oh, and before I get on to this next story about how the Democratic Party is dead, let me just say thank you, everybody who donates, who's a member, all those things. You make this show possible. I never try and make it sound like I'm living under a bridge, so I'm not saying that. But in terms of this show, it's not quite sustainable to do live streams this much, and just to, without a certain number of members. And so it's yet to be sustainable, but I'm hoping if I, just keep working hard and keep covering important stories, maybe it'll get there. Anyway, the way to become a member, it'd be 38 cents an episode, $6 a month, is at Locals, which is leecamp.net. And you get all kinds of perks. You get both my ebooks, Dangerous Ideas, and Bullet Points and Punchlines. You get my comedy special. Anyway, tons of perks to sign up at leecamp.net. You can also now sign up at Patreon, patreon.com/leecamp. So I hope you will do one of those. Okay, let's keep moving. This topic of the death of the Democratic Party was it sparked in me when I saw this video. Um, and it's posted by Joseph Kishore. I don't know him, but it says California Governor Newsom filmed himself dismantling homeless encampments. And here's the video. There's not really any sound to it. But for those of you listening to the podcast, it's Newsom has California governor. He's really one of the top Democrats. Like, he's probably one of the top 3 to 4 Democrats you can name in the country that are currently in office. And he has made it part of his platform, part of his goal to basically just destroy homeless people. And he has helped pass these laws that basically say you can just destroy homeless camps. You can get rid of them. You can push them around. You can do all this shit. And he's now filmed himself, because politicians don't do anything like this to not be filmed. The whole point is to be filmed. And he's now filmed himself throwing homeless people's stuff into a dump. And this person said that having himself filmed dismantling homeless encampments is aimed at graphically disassociating the Democrats from any policies of social reform, encouraging political backwardness and anti-immigrant attitudes, and forging a bloc with the far right. Yeah, and I wouldn't just say forging a bloc. I'd say it's almost the entirety of the American political system is now one party. But yeah, I think that it's important to note the disassociation of Democrats from social reform. And so I just put together a quick list. Obviously, it's much larger than this. You guys can add to it in the comments threads. But of all the things that the Democratic Party no longer stands for, that they used to pretend to stand for, at least, I'm not going to act like 20 and 30 years ago the Democrats were amazing. But it used to be that the Democrats at least gave lip service to caring about homeless people. And now you can see this is Gavin Newsom. This is many Democratic governors of states just doing everything they can to punch down, to punch the poorest people in our nation, to go up to people who are largely mentally ill, who are struggling, who are living on the streets in a fucked up system that has completely destroyed their lives, and say, get out of here, because you don't have money. You are basically not a citizen, which is not true. Citizenship is not supposed to be based on money, but that's the way we're treating it. So Democrats no longer care at all about the homeless. Not the Democrats I see speaking day to day. I mean, how often do they even bring them up? Caring for the working poor was another thing, right? It had to do with caring for unions, talking a lot about unions and union work. Hell, even Joe Biden, who's been a scam ever since he started, but he used to speak a lot about unions and now rarely ever does. They don't care about unions. They haven't stood up for unions in Congress. And unions are now what, 7% of the workforce? If you ever look at a chart, I haven't pulled it up, but you look at a chart of unions membership over time, it just crashes to recent years. And so the Democrats do not stand for the working poor at all. Now, the Republicans don't either, nor do they care for homeless. But the Republicans don't really claim to. I mean, Donald Trump will say some things about workers, but yeah, it's not. I mean, all you have to do is a quick Google search and you can find out he's lying about all of it. The Democrats used to give, it wasn't just more lip service. They had more Band-Aids. The Democrats are very good at throwing, at least in the past, very good at throwing Band-Aids on things to pretend they care about them. A Band-Aid on unions, Band-Aid on minimum wage, blah, blah, blah. They barely even do any of that anymore. The Band-Aids are now stopping because they don't care about throwing the Band-Aids on. Here's another one. Democrats caring for the environment. That used to be a concept that was pushed a lot, you know, and Al Gore notoriously was attacked for it a lot because Bush would say he wants to take your tax dollars and give it to eagles or things like that. Like, so it used to be something Democrats would talk about. But now, not only are they not talking about it, but Joe Biden literally produced more oil pumped out more oil to kill this planet than Donald Trump did in his 4 years. Biden has also allowed more drilling on public lands than Donald Trump did in his 4 years. Now, this doesn't mean Donald Trump is better. Donald Trump was probably trying to do this and just was less facile at it, less equipped to facilitate these things. But then not than Biden, but then Biden's team, Biden's administration. So, yeah, very little care for the environment, but they're barely even talking. That again, the Band-Aids have stopped. Here was one of the Band-Aids. I'll give you one of the Band-Aids that Biden ran on last time around. One of the Band-Aids was, whenever he would mention climate change, which is just a little here and there, one of the Band-Aids was, we're going to put 500,000 charging stations across the nation. 500,000 charging for electric vehicles, EVs. And even if he had done that, let's say day one, that was just done. Poof, 500,000 charging stations. That doesn't fix the climate change. It doesn't fix the world. Yes, it's better to have electric cars than not electric cars, but we need to seriously change our entire economic structure to not be obliterating this planet in the rate we're doing it. Now, a Band-Aid's better than nothing. If I have a bad cut, I'd rather have a Band-Aid than nothing. But it's a Band-Aid. However, here's how much Biden did about the Band-Aid. Congress provided $7.5 billion for electric vehicle chargers. Wow, that sounds good. So far, they built zero. Congress, at the urging of the Biden administration, agreed in 2021 to spend $7.5 billion to build tens of thousands of electric vehicle chargers across the country, aiming to appease anxious drivers while tackling climate change, which would not tackle climate change. The program has yet to install a single charger. So there you go. There's somehow they can go to war overnight. They can send bombs to Israel to be dropped on children in a day, just like that. But you ask them to put a charger to plug in your little electric car, can't get it done. Impossible. 4 years, not possible. Can't do it. All right. Moving on to another one. Caring about immigrants. That used to be a thing that Democrats gave a little lip service to, a little bit of Band-Aids. They had some things here and there to show that the immigrants were important. They had some things in their speeches about immigrants being important to America. Now, zero. It's gone. It's over. Biden has actually deported more people than Trump. And I've covered this a few times. Here's from Reuters. Biden is now deporting more people than Trump. And if you Google this, there's a couple. Here's the thing: is both sides hate this. This is an interesting statistics because Democrats hate it because they're supposed to be the party that care, and they don't care at all. So it looks bad for them to be deporting more than Trump. Republicans hate this because Trump was supposed to be the tough on immigration guy. He gets all the immigrants. He'd shoot them in the street if he could, kind of guy. And instead, Biden's deporting more than Trump. So both sides hate this statistic that Biden is deporting more people than Trump. And so if you Google it, you'll find multiple articles saying, no, it's not true, not true. But if you actually look into it, it actually is true. The articles saying it's not true are just fiddling with terminology. They're saying, oh, well, it doesn't count as deported. If you catch them at the border and then send them back immediately, that's not deported. Yeah, it is. It is deported. You're just fucking with linguistics to try and make your point right. Democrats also used to be the party of questioning the intelligence state, questioning the CIA, questioning the FBI, questioning the NSA, questioning these secret entities that destroy our lives, that destroy lives over abroad, that destroy countries, that coup countries. They used to be the ones, not all of them, but a significant portion of them used to be the ones that say, hey, is this right? Should this be okay? Now, nothing. And if anything, they're the ones, the Democrats are the ones that are most cheerleading for the CIA and the FBI. Oh, the CIA is going to save us from Donald Trump. The CIA is the best. We love them. They protect us. The FBI is awesome. James Comey's a hero. So the only questioning the CIA or the FBI or something is coming from a few Republicans, but even that is fucking piecemeal. It's meaningless. It's like, how much have you seen the CIA reined in? How much did you see the CIA reined in under Trump and Pompeo? Zero. Zero. So, yeah, there's a few Republicans who say, I don't think the CIA should be doing this, but it's meaningless. But it is interesting that you've seen a flip. The Democrats used to be the ones who say, I don't know if the CIA should be doing this. Now the Republicans are the ones saying, I don't know if the CIA should be doing this. And neither of them do anything. Democrats used to be the party of regulating corporations. There's essentially zero sign of that. And when there is some kind of regulation that hits a corporation, it's basically they accept and improve the rule. It's basically that that corporation didn't do a good enough job of buying off our Congress, and so they were easy pickings. But largely doesn't happen. And as long as the company is large enough, as long as it's not a small beans. And of course, you have the fact that BlackRock is all up in the Biden administration. It's got many members of BlackRock, and BlackRock, State Street and Vanguard are the three largest corporations in the entire world. They're these massive shadow banks, investment banks that own are the top shareholders of 88% of all the companies on the S&P 500. The fact that Democrats don't stand. So again, you can throw some other areas in that you want in the chat where Democrats used to at least give some lip service to it, and now they've abandoned it. That was just a quick list I threw together and of course the endless wars, both sides, etc. Giant police state. Democrats used to seem to care a little bit or acted like they did. It's all thrown out. So this is the end. Like, for me, Gavin Newsom, like, kicking homeless people while they're down and throwing away their stuff and videotaping himself to be proud of it is really, it's filming the end of the Democratic Party. Even the guise of the Democratic Party. We have one party, and the Democrats seem to be the ones that are fading out. So you're basically just ending up with the Republican Party. That's all it is. And sometimes you'll have Democrats that are Republicans, but they call themselves Democrats, but that doesn't really mean anything. It's just the Republican Party. But so anyway, the fact that Democrats don't stand for any of these things anymore doesn't just show that the ruling elite, there's no difference between Democrats and Republicans. Yes, it shows that, but it also shows the hollowness, the emptiness of the liberal class across America. The values that made up the skeleton of the society that was supposed to be the liberal society, those values are now proven completely empty, completely vapid, completely hollow. It's just meaningless. And so what you're left with is just a facade. You're left with the Black Lives Matter flag in the front yard. You're left with the rainbow flag. You're left with the fact that there's a black woman press secretary at the White House. You're just left with the facade of the thing. You're not actually left with the values. And to me, that is the end of the Democratic Party. That is the end. That's where it ends. Just a flag in a yard with no difference between them and the Republicans in a waning U.S. empire that is committing genocide on a daily basis. That's it. That's the end point. That's the end point. And this doesn't mean I don't have any hope. I have hope for humanity. I have hope for people. I see hope in groups like mutual aid and Doctors Without Borders. And there was a video, maybe I'll bring it to you in another live stream, of Doctors Without Border coming back. Doctors Without Borders doctor, a doctor from Doctors Without Borders, coming back from Gaza and saying, he's been in all kinds of war zone and he's never seen anything so horrific. And so that's what made me think of them. But Doctors Without Borders, RIP Medical Debt, these great organizations that are actually doing things for people. So I have hope in humanity. I don't have any hope in the Democrats or the Republicans or this pathetic, disgusting, soulless U.S. empire that's committing genocide right now. There's no hope in that. There's hope in people. There's hope in individuals. There's hope in you and me, and the fact that all of you care enough to even watch something that talks about these issues is like, that's where I see hope. Not in these soulless pieces of shit who are you governor of the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world, and you spend your time filming yourself punching homeless people. That's what does that mean to anyone? What is that? It's just pathetic. Okay. I'm going to wrap up this segment of this live stream, but we're now going to go to my interview with Ben Norton. Some of you may have seen this because I posted it as a separate segment, but it has not yet been on the live stream. So many of you probably have not seen this interview, and I think you're really going to love it. So for those of you who have, again, you are not, I'm not holding you down. There's no gun to your head. You can turn it off if you'd like. But for those of you who have not seen this interview, you're really going to enjoy it with journalist Ben Norton. He does geopolitical economy report, and he's awesome. And I often am quoting from him on this show. I'll often mention him. Okay, so I'm not going to come back after that interview, but I do these live streams Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. This one was a little later time than normal, but they're often 3 p.m. Eastern, noon Pacific. And it's a little bit weird for the month of August because I'm traveling to see family, but I'm still bringing you special shows, special episodes, all that stuff. So keep checking back. And most importantly, I hope you see and you've gotten enough out of this to become a member at patreon.com/LeeCamp or at leecamp.net, which will forward you to my locals page, and then scroll down to become a subscriber when you get there. Okay. So without further ado, here is my discussion with the always amazing Ben Norton. Hey,
thanks for having me, Lee. And you're my favorite comedian.
Sorry, I had it on fast forward because I was finding the right place to start.
So,
thank you. You're my favorite smart guy. So. It's tough to know where to begin, but let's begin with, this latest U.S.-backed coup attempt in Venezuela. I wanted to get kind of to the deeper issue of why it is that the U.S. has it out for Venezuela in such a kind of unique way. I mean, there's only a few countries in the world that the U.S. seems to go after with the same vitriol regularity as they do Venezuela. And you recently on your podcast spoke about how it's much deeper than just oil reserves, which is what I have often said, but there's a lot more to it.
Yeah, I mean, certainly oil is a factor. I'll talk about that. And we've seen Donald Trump in a 2023 Republican Party rally. He said, we came so close to taking over Venezuela, we would have gotten all of its oil. So in that comment, I mean, it says a lot. First of all, he has this kind of neo-colonial view, we're going to take over the country. And then he immediately says we could have gotten its oil. So yeah. I'm not disputing that that's important. There's also another clip of John Bolton, who was Donald Trump's neoconservative national security advisor, who oversaw the coup attempt in Venezuela that the Trump administration launched in 2019. And in an interview on Fox News, Bolton said openly that the Trump administration was working with U.S. oil companies that wanted to invest in Venezuela. And why would they want to do that? Well, because Venezuela's oil belongs to the state, belongs to the people of the country through the state-owned company PDVSA. And the previous leftist president, Hugo Chavez, who died in 2013, he had kicked out all of the U.S. oil corporations and made it 100% state-owned. And of course, U.S. companies do want to get access to that oil. So that's certainly a factor. And Venezuela does have the world's largest oil reserves. But as you mentioned, it's not the only factor. In fact, a lot of people don't know that actually the U.S. is the world's largest oil producer. A big reason for that is the shale oil boom in the 2010s. And actually, Obama boasted about this. He was holding a meeting with a bunch of Republicans, and he famously said, when people on Wall Street, when I was in power, they complained. And he says, did you look at where your portfolio was when I started and where it was when I left? Just say thank you. And he also boasted of making the U.S. the world's largest oil producer. So the U.S. doesn't necessarily
shale oil boom was also the flammable tap water boom. So we got to have both.
Yeah, exactly. So, and this is because of fracking, of course. So the devastating communities that have been hurt by fracking in order to make the U.S. the world's largest oil producer. Anyway, the point is that So it's not like the U.S. necessarily needs Venezuela's oil, but there are a few reasons why. First of all, inflation is obviously a very important issue, and we've seen in the U.S. that compared to the rest of the world, actually, inflation in the U.S. hasn't been that bad, but that might be surprising to a lot of people because obviously inflation in the U.S. has been pretty horrible. And for instance, Argentina right now, under this libertarian U.S.-backed leader, Javier Milei, they have over 200% inflation per year. The U.S. inflation after the pandemic peaked like around like 8 or 9% per year. So imagine, I mean, it's still pretty bad, but like in other countries. But anyway, the point is that obviously inflation can be very destabilizing for a government. And Biden, leading up to the midterms in 2022, he actually took a lot of oil out of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in order to try to bring down oil prices, gas prices before the elections, right? Because obviously one of the biggest contributors to inflation is energy prices, because you need gas to transport goods. If you're going to go buy food at the store, how are you going to get the food there? Well, they transport it on big trucks, and those trucks need oil. So when oil prices go up, food prices tend to go up, right? So this is one of the things that the U.S. is very concerned about. Even though it has a lot of oil and exports oil, it wants to maintain stability in global oil markets. And one of the ways of doing that is pressuring other countries or ordering other countries to increase or decrease their oil production, depending on whether you want to increase or decrease the global oil price. We saw this when Joe Biden, he promised during his presidential campaign that he would cut relations with Saudi Arabia over its brutal war crimes in Yemen that the U.S. government under the Obama administration, when he was vice president, supported, and Trump also. And then, of course, when he came into office, he did a 180, and he went to Saudi Arabia, and he fist bumped with Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and he begged Saudi Arabia, can you please produce more oil, pump more oil to bring down global oil prices? And Saudi Arabia, which is part of OPEC, said no, because they wanted high oil prices. So if the U.S. can overthrow Venezuela's government and U.S. companies can profit from Venezuela's oil, of course, they fund U.S. politicians and they would profit from it. But also it's a way of the U.S. trying to maintain global oil prices, right? Mm-hmm. But obviously, so I talk a lot about oil here, but it's not just about oil, right? It's also significantly geopolitical because Cuba does not have significant oil reserves. And Cuba has been under a U.S. blockade for over 60 years. I mean, the U.S. has constantly, for our entire lifetimes, for the lifetimes of my parents, the U.S. has been trying to overthrow the Cuban government.
They tried to assassinate Fidel hundreds of times, and ultimately they got him with natural causes.
Yeah, 638 times. There's a documentary about this. And they did crazy things like they poisoned cigars and tried to give them to him. They poisoned a swimsuit, like a diving suit, because they knew that he liked to dive, and tried to poison him. They gave him an exploding cigar. And my favorite story, by the way, is that the CIA sent a female agent to Cuba to try to sleep with Fidel, and she fell in love with him and decided not to kill him. So,
really? I didn't know that one.
So anyway, obviously Cuba doesn't have significant oil or natural resources, but it does have a socialist government that is, the threat of a good example, with one of the best health systems in Latin America, with one of the best education systems, despite the fact that it's still a relatively poor country and has been under brutal sanctions and a brutal embargo for over 60 years. And then, of course, there's the geopolitical element. So Venezuela is a very close friend and ally of China, of Russia, of Iran, of many other countries that are part of the global south that are, targeted by the U.S., like Syria, like Zimbabwe, the DPRK, all of these countries that the U.S. is trying to overthrow and destabilize. Venezuela has been closely allied with them. And not just that, starting with the previous president, Hugo Chavez, who came to power in 1999, and he later declared the Bolivarian Revolution, named after Simon Bolivar. Who was Bolivar? He was the Venezuelan general who successfully overthrew Spanish colonialism and freed South America. And So in the Bolivarian Revolution, one of the key goals has been to build a multipolar world. Hugo Chavez was talking about this during his presidential campaign in 1998. Now we hear this word thrown around so much, multipolarity, multipolar world. He was talking about it over 20 years ago. And Venezuela has played an important role in helping to build many of these institutions. So Venezuela, although it's not technically part of BRICS, has always been supportive of BRICS and has participated as an observer in BRICS summits and has applied to join BRICS and likely will join soon. Venezuela, under Chavez and now under Maduro, has been a leader of Latin American regional organizations like the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, the CELAC, which was created as an alternative by Venezuela and Cuba to the US-dominated Organization of American States, which is based in Washington, largely funded by the US. Fidel Castro in Cuba famously referred to the OAS as the Ministry of the Yankee Colonies. So, we see that Venezuela, along with Cuba, played a role in building alternatives so the US cannot try to control Latin America. Venezuela also played a lead role in building an economic organization of Latin American unity, which is called the Bolivarian Alliance, the ALBA. And Venezuela created a currency. This was nearly 15 years ago now. Over 15 years ago now, actually. Starting in 2007, 2008, Venezuela created a currency that was called the sucre that was used for trade in Latin America, so they didn't need the US dollar. And for a variety of reasons, it ended up, Chavez died in 2013. There were coups in other countries in Latin America. They lost some left-wing allies, and that project basically died. But it's another example of how prescient Venezuela was, because today, de-dollarization has become a very hot topic all around the world. Brazil's President Lula da Silva says he wants to create a Latin American currency. Well, Hugo Chavez did that for a few years. So the point is that obviously oil is a significant factor, but it's not just that, because, if Venezuela were like Saudi Arabia and it had an obedient government that largely followed US orders, Saudi Arabia is now being a little more independent, but for most of Saudi Arabia's history, it just obediently did whatever the US wanted, and the US trained its leaders and its military. And yeah, Saudi Arabia actually have a state-owned company. They're certainly not socialist, but Saudi Aramco owns their oil. But they work with foreign companies and they play ball. And if the US wants them to increase oil production to bring down oil prices, they'll sometimes do it historically. If Venezuela did all of that, then the US would be fine. But of course, Venezuela doesn't do that. Venezuela is completely independent and sovereign. And the Bolivarian Revolution, started by Chavez, continued by Maduro, is expressly dedicated, they say it, to challenging the US empire and creating a new multipolar world in which countries in Latin America and Africa and Asia have an equal voice and cannot be crushed under the boot of Western corporate monopolies. And obviously, Western corporate monopolies run Western governments, so they're very angry about that.
I had forgotten that about creating a new currency Chavez had, and it seems like these leaders that look into or do create a currency outside the dollar have this odd coincidence of dying. I don't know why that is, but
quick note,
Gaddafi. Because Gaddafi,
so Gaddafi in Libya, he tried to create a Pan-African currency, and also Saddam Hussein. Not that I'm glorifying Saddam Hussein, but Saddam Hussein, he was obviously overthrown by the U.S. and they invaded and destroyed his country and killed over 1 million Iraqis. And Saddam Hussein, before the U.S. invasion, he began selling oil in euros. And at that time, now it sounds goofy because we all know that the European Union today is basically controlled by the US, and European think tanks are publishing articles warning about the vassalization of Europe by the US. But let's not forget that when the EU was created in the late 90s and then into the early 2000s, a lot of people still thought that it would be this kind of independent pole in a multipolar world, that it would not obediently follow the US. Let's not forget that actually France and Germany opposed the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and there was this whole anti-French campaign. You probably remember, like they renamed renamed French fries freedom fries and all this nonsense.
Can you imagine a time where France would go against the United States?
Yeah. So at that time, when Iraq was when it said we're not going to sell our oil in dollars, that was actually very scandalous. And now fast forward, in the past few years, not only did Venezuela create this currency, but Venezuela has also been selling its oil in other currencies, especially Chinese yuan. And they did that years ago, not just like the past 2 years with the war in Ukraine. They've been doing this for like almost a decade, selling their oil in other currencies.
Yeah, one of
And
my
it's in
favorite.
response to the U.S. sanctions, obviously.
Right. One of my favorite moments was, and this is, I can't remember, if it was like the end of Obama administration or maybe the first year of Trump or something, but Pakistan, it was when they first started selling their oil to China, or buying oil from China, or whatever it is, selling in yuan instead of US dollars. And when they did, within days, it was like 3 days or 5 days later, the US added Pakistan to the list of nations that violate religious freedom. And I was like, well, those two don't seem linked at all.
Yeah, exactly.
But
the big difference now is that there's been a lot of interest in that in so many countries in the global south, but it basically got to the breaking point. Now, the Washington Post finally, I mean, I'm not one to praise the Washington Post. You know, they are owned by Jeff Bezos, but finally they did this report acknowledging that the U.S. is waging economic war around the world, and they admitted that 60% of countries on Earth are under U.S. sanctions. 60%. It's crazy. So, I mean, sorry, let me take that back. Actually, you can edit this, right?
It's a third of, yeah.
I misspoke.
Yeah. It's a third of all nations that we have
and
sanctions.
60%. Yeah, I misspoke. Let me say that. And the Washington Post admitted that 1/3 of all countries on Earth are sanctioned by the U.S., including 60% of poor countries, a majority of poor countries. So obviously, if the U.S. is going to tell everyone around the world they can't use the banking system, which makes it hard to use transactions in dollars, they're going to look for alternatives. So, you know, there was increasing interest, but it got to the breaking point, and especially with a big country like Russia, which is basically too big to sanction, we see that levee has been broken, right? The dam has been broken, and now all of that is flooding out, and so many countries are seeking alternatives to the dollar.
Speaking of U.S. adversaries, the number one on that list now increasingly seems to be China. The U.S. views, I mean, the U.S. ruling elite, most of them view, harming or decreasing China's ability to keep growing as the key aspect to maintaining or grasping at U.S. hegemony. I just want you to talk for a bit about China's economy. And, one of the most fascinating things I think people ask a lot about is why China is able to do large infrastructure projects that it seems the United States is completely incapable of. Everything from bullet chains to China built whole hospitals in days during the pandemic. It's just a lot there that people look at and go, why is it China's capable of this and the U.S. is not?
Well, the very simple answer is honestly because the government does it, because they're not relying on private companies to do it that only want to make money, right? Because if a company is going to do something, they're only going to do it if they're motivated by profits to do it. If it's not profitable to make high-speed rail because they're not going to make enough money, if it's not profitable to make public hospitals, they don't do it. So in the US, none of this stuff happens because infrastructure is actually not that profitable unless you can make a big toll booth and charge people money every time they use your road, which increasingly we see across the US, more and more toll booths, right? In China, of course, China has a mixed economy. They do have private companies, but when it comes to infrastructure, it's almost entirely state-owned. And this is something that people really do not understand about China. About 1/3 of China's GDP comes from what are known as state-owned enterprises, SOEs. I mean, state companies, government-owned companies, and they're concentrated in what's known as the commanding heights of the economy, the most strategic elements of the economy. So for instance, all of the major banks are owned by the state. The huge, massive banks, there's 4 big ones, are the 4 biggest banks on earth by total assets, and they're owned by the state. Furthermore, the big telecommunications companies are owned by the state. So whereas in the US, you have a few monopolies to choose from, Verizon and T-Mobile, whatever. In China, they're all state-owned, and in China, I have a phone plan, and I literally pay about $3, 21 yuan, about $3 per month for 20 gigabytes of data. I mean, it's like a joke. I mean, it's so much cheaper. Whereas in the US, you have these corporate monopolies and they charge you monopoly rents. They charge you $50, $60 at least a month, right? Furthermore, in China, all of the infrastructure is owned by the state. And the companies that build that infrastructure are state-owned companies. And so, for instance, if you look at the high-speed rail is actually very cheap in China. I think you've gone on it, and it's very good, some of the best in the world. And it's like, if you want to go from Beijing to like Shanghai, for instance, it's like 70 or 80 US dollars, which is insanely cheap compared to flying or compared to like even Amtrak in the US, considering how far Shanghai and Beijing are from each other.
Yeah, the Amtrak trip from DC to New York, which is supposed to take 4 hours, but often takes 6. It's like $100 usually or something.
Yeah, I mean, there you go. So the reality is that the way that China can build all this infrastructure and then maintain it and keep it very cheap is simply because it's done by state-owned companies that are not operating simply to maximize profits. They are operating on behalf of the people, and they also provide larger positive externalities. You know, economists talk about this idea of externalities. We often know of it in the negative connotation. So a negative externality is pollution, right? So an oil company, they don't care about the pollution. For them, that's an externality. All they care about is their bottom line, right? There are such things as positive externalities. And if the government actually invests in these utilities and public services, like infrastructure, like high-speed rail, even if the government loses money, it often has positive externalities in the rest of the economy. So as an example of this, I was reading a study in China that was very interesting about how some parts of the high-speed rail actually lose money. But overall, because the entire system is state-owned, it does not lose money. So unlike in Britain, for instance, the UK under Margaret Thatcher, the neoliberal queen, they privatized the railroads, right? And however, in some parts of Europe, actually, railroads are still state-owned, like the Netherlands, and they actually have much better results, whereas the privatized railroads have much worse results. However, what happened in the neoliberal era in the UK is they didn't privatize everything. They only privatized the profitable parts of the railroad infrastructure, and they kept the non-profitable parts controlled by the state. So literally, we see an example of the privatization of profits and the socialization of losses. In China, this is true. There are some parts of the railroad, like maintaining the physical infrastructure, because it's so capital intensive and they need to invest a lot, they lose money. But because they found that one of the most profitable parts of the railroad was actually the stations. And why is that? Because in the stations, they rent out a lot of space to businesses and restaurants that charge inflated prices. You know, they charge you twice as much as the food would cost outside of the station, right? So, but this, because the government is renting out those spaces, they are making the profit from renting that out. It's not private. And that profit balances the losses they make in other parts of the system. So China has created a system that creates larger benefits for the rest of the economy and supports other businesses and creates other jobs built around the railroad infrastructure. And even if they lose money in part of it, they don't care, because it's all about building a better economy for the people. Whereas in the US, even if one part of it is not profitable, obviously no company's not going to do it. So the government's not going to do that. And what we end up having is we simply do not have high-speed rail, period. California's been talking about this for decades. It just hasn't happened because it's not profitable, and because the government is not willing to actually, I mean, the government could try to do these things and lose some money, but if they wanted to actually make it profitable, they would have to go against these big companies and nationalize some of their property, which they'll never do.
And there used to be a time in the United States where there was at least some of that. I mean, most of our highway system was not built to be profitable, and going to the moon was not meant to be profitable.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, FDR oversaw most of the very good infrastructure production in the US. And now, we have this big debate constantly where people talk about our infrastructure is falling apart. We need to build an infrastructure. Biden always boasts of the so-called bipartisan infrastructure law that he passed. That's the real name. So, I mean, like, there's this big debate, but it's always, we have to have private companies that invest in building this infrastructure, but the state will give them some subsidies. So once again, the only way to get them to do it is the government will give them a bunch of money so it's profitable, but they won't do it on their own. And they talk about public-private partnerships, but there's a really good economist, Mariana Mazzucato, she's very mainstream economist. She's been an advisor for European governments. She's from Italy, but is in the US. And she has a famous book called The Entrepreneurial State. She's not a socialist, she's a mainstream economist. And in this book, she talks about how this myth of the free market, even in the US, is not true. So for instance, we know that in addition to all of the major infrastructure that was built back then, and it's falling apart today, and we can't get good infrastructure, bridges are literally collapsing.
Yep.
Well, it's not just that.
I live in Baltimore. You don't need to open the wound like that, Ben.
Yeah, but it's not just infrastructure. So Mariana Mazzucato showed how most of the modern technology we're using right now comes from the Pentagon. And obviously, it's from the military. Like, I'm not praising the military spending, but it was not private companies that invested in this research. It comes largely from DARPA, which is this, known as the Pentagon's brain. So as an example, if you look at our phone, touchscreen technology comes from the US military. Location technology, GPS technology comes from the
internet,
Navy because they wanted to track their ships.
The internet,
so many semiconductors. Go ahead.
The internet.
Yeah, the internet itself. So the government, this is the thing in the US, is that we have privatization of profits and socialization of losses. And in China, they have socialization of profits and socialization of losses.
Yeah. I guess I'll just wrap up with this. Where do you have predictions? Where do you see the U.S.-China relationship going? It seems like the U.S. at every step is trying to, push towards basically the same type of shit we have with Russia, proxy war. It seems like the U.S. is trying to create that with China. Of course, all these economic war efforts, tariffs, sanctions. Do you see anything slowing this path?
Realistically, unfortunately not. The reality is that this is completely bipartisan. And, obviously it was Donald Trump that really started the trade war on China and really kicked the new Cold War into high gear. And his neoconservative former CIA director turned Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, gave this infamous speech at the Richard Nixon Library in which he said that it was a mistake to normalize relations with China. And he basically called for overthrowing the Chinese government. So obviously, the Republicans are much more extreme, but the Democrats, they're not as openly extreme, but they basically share the same policy on China. And we've seen that Biden has continued all of Trump's policies. And actually, it was Obama that really started it, and then Trump kicked it into high gear. So Obama and the Hillary Clinton State Department, they declared a so-called pivot to Asia. And as our friend Brian Becker says, when they say pivot to Asia, they mean pivot to war in Asia. So pivot to war on China is what they meant. Yeah. And specifically, the whole idea was, okay, we're going to wrap up the wars in the so-called Middle East, which is West Asia, and we're going to move all those troops to East Asia off the coast of China, and we're going to plan for a war. And we've seen even some U.S. generals threatening war, saying that they think we're going to be in war as soon as 2025. I think that's, I think that's too soon. I think it's part of like this whole Mad Men strategy where they're trying to scare people in China. But unfortunately, both political parties have made it clear that they're hell-bent on this. And it's because, as Anthony Blinken famously said in a speech where he called for shaping the strategic environment around China. That's the language he used. He means containment, a new Cold War and containment policy. And in that speech, he famously said, Russia's a short-term threat, but China is the biggest so-called long-term threat because China not only has the will, but the means to transform the global system. China is the world's largest economy when its GDP is measured at purchasing power parity, which is the best way to measure the size of the economy. instead of just converting everything to dollars, which makes the US economy look bigger than it actually is. China has the world's largest military now. China has 1.4 billion people. China now has some of the best universities in the world. It has some of the best scientists and engineers. It's advancing in high-tech technology, like, semiconductors. It's catching up very quickly. Like also electric vehicles and solar panels, which is why the US is tariffing and banning all of these technologies. And really, the US goal was admitted by the US Commerce Secretary, Gina Raimondo. She said openly that the US goal is to prevent China from innovating. And she said that we must work with Europe to prevent China from developing. And then she also later said, we will do everything we can to prevent China from getting access to the most advanced technology. And this is the Democratic administration. If Trump comes back, it's going to be a whole new level of extreme aggression against China. So unfortunately, we know that the warmongers in Washington, from both parties, are always looking for a convenient scapegoat to blame for all their problems. So they don't blame, Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family for the opioid epidemic in the US, which was caused by these pharmaceutical corporations that were profiting from giving people these drugs they didn't need. Instead of blaming them, they blame China. Instead of talking about, the horrific problems of gun violence, all this stuff, they blame China for everything. So the reality is that it's too convenient of a scapegoat. It's also for the Republicans, it's like an existential threat because China is an atheistic country. They're non-white. They're communist. So then they can say, this is the perfect boogeyman, right? That the Republicans want to fight against. The Democrats can say that they're violating so-called democracy and human rights and all this nonsense rhetoric that they use as if the US were a democracy, which it's not. So unfortunately, it's like the perfect enemy that the ruling class in Washington want to justify all of the policies that they implement that are bad for the people of the US, but are good for the military industrial complex. And there basically are no incentives pushing politicians in the US to not want more aggression against China, because all of the big companies that fund their campaigns, all of the big corporations are on board with this.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's also a lot easier to keep people under control when you have a big bad monster out there that's going to get them. Thank you so much, Ben, for taking the time. What's the best way for people to follow all your work?
Well, thanks for having me, Lee. People can go to geopoliticaleconomy.com and find links to everything. And of course, I'm very active on YouTube. And I also have my videos backed up on Rumble and Odyssey. So yeah, people can just, if you look up Geopolitical Economy Report, you can find it on all platforms. And Lee, keep up the great work. I always love watching your videos, and thanks for helping keep things funny and make us laugh and not all go crazy from how insane the world is.
I'm doing my best to not go crazy myself, but thank you so much, Ben. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. Keep up the fight.
My pleasure.
All right, Ben Norton, Geopolitical Economy Report. Check it out if you haven't already. I'll be back with you very soon. And sorry, this had to be a pre-taped show. I am doing some traveling, so I'm trying to still bring you guys awesome shows anyway. Make sure you click subscribe if you haven't already, and the bell icon, and keep fighting.